So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We're really excited to have a different presenter on with us this evening, as we have another mental performance consultant from Canadian Sports Center Atlantic with us tonight. So we have Chris here with us, and he will be talking to us about how to working with emotions. So a really cool topic that hopefully will benefit a lot of coaches, especially during this time of COVID-19, where there's a lot of emotions amongst everyone. So thank you so much, Chris, and you can take it away from here.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in and thank everybody for your time as well. Thanks for the introduction. I am a mental performance consultant with the Canadian Sports Center Atlantic, and I've been fortunate to see a lot of other great talks throughout the coach socialization session. So I was happy to jump on and contribute myself as well. So as we said, we'll use the chat throughout, but there will be some times where I'll ask some questions. So I'll encourage you to share your answers within the chat as well. So in terms of an overview for the presentation this evening, obviously the title is Working with Emotions, and I really wanted to call it Working with Emotions because it can be so easy to work against emotions. And hopefully through this presentation this evening, we'll get some strategies of how we work with them. So for part one, it's really checking in with emotions. How do we check in? How do we identify different emotions of what's going on? How do we know the impact that emotions can have on us? And also knowing our objectives in a situation is an important part of that. And then part two, as I'm sure a lot of coaches are aware, we work often with individuals who are experiencing a variety of emotions, and how do we work with athletes and how do we work with their emotions as well? A part of that is our own self-awareness, and then a big part of speaking the same language of the athlete, which I'll get into. So the next part is really, we can't flick the switch with emotions. And I think a lot of times with emotions, we think like, oh, I don't want to feel that, or I want to feel that. And it can be easy to think of emotions as like a light switch, where it's like, let's just turn it on or just turn it off. And, you know, if I say to some of you in the chat, if I say, hey, just feel happy, just be happy. I don't think you'd be that effective in doing that. If I say, you know, feel sad right now, just flick that switch and feel sad. Or if you say, you know, to an athlete, hey, you know, just be confident, just feel confident. It's hard to directly control our emotions. It's hard to just flick a switch on those emotions. It doesn't really work out that way. So knowing that we can't directly control our emotions, it's really important to learn how to work with them, because changing them directly is really difficult. So hopefully this evening we'll get some strategies of how do we work with emotions, because we can't always just flip that switch really quickly. So, and I appreciate Kirsty's also going through and she's changing the slides for me as I go, and she's doing a fantastic job. So I'll thank her for that. So when it comes to working with emotions, it's about sitting in the driver's seat. So I want you to picture yourself on a bus, right? And you're sitting on this bus, and in the back seat is, you know, all these different emotions on the bus with you. And, you know, we can have so many different emotions at any given time. And what I want you to do is think of yourself on that bus. And one approach that you could take is to try to like force every emotion off the bus. You could like grab each, like I'm gonna grab this anger emotion here, and I'm gonna try to take it off the bus, and then I'm gonna go sadness and take it off so I don't feel these emotions. And so then they won't get in my way. But if we try to do that, it's a lot of work. And as we've established already, it's really hard to just change emotions. So what I want you to do instead is to think of, hey, I know I'm going to have these emotions with me along for the ride. And the goal is to be aware of who's in the driver's seat. Maybe can I get a yes in the chat if you've ever been in a situation where you felt like your emotions were in the driver's seat. So when you're acting on emotion and where you felt like maybe that was anger, and that anger was driving, and that was and anger was dictating where you were going. They were driving the bus and you were almost like a victim, almost felt less control and felt like you were the one in the back passenger seat. Whether it be anger, sadness, frustration. I see a lot of yeses, yes, yeah. And we feel those things. And the goal with regulating emotions or working with emotions is not to get rid of them, because that's really hard. But what we want to do is we want to make sure we're in the driver's seat. So we're sitting there, we're the ones in control of the wheel. but we also know we have these emotions in the back seat. So I'm going to go over a three-step process of how do we make sure we're the ones sitting in the driver's seat. And those 3 steps for getting into the driver's seat, it's who's on the bus. We need to know who's on that bus if we want to be in the driver's seat. Who's on there with us? Where do they want to go? Right? Emotions have somewhere where they want to go, and we need to know where they want to go and where they want to take us. We also need to know where do we need to go? Where is our destination? Where do we want to go? So step 1, who's on the bus? There can be a lot of different people or emotions on the bus at any given time, but I want to ask you, and you can answer in the group chat there, is what emotions do you see in sport? So whether do you experience as coaches or do you senior athletes a lot? So could you share some of the emotions that you see come up a lot in sport? Happiness, yeah. Doubt, yeah. Frustration, yeah. Joy, frustration, excitement, fear, doubt, anger, happiness, yeah. See, yeah, doubt was there a couple times, happiness was there. And we feel all these emotions, and it's important to know confusion, yeah. We feel so many different emotions, and those emotions are with us, they're on that bus with us. And part of the reason why we feel these emotions so often and so much is because we invest so much into sport. It's because we allow ourselves to care a lot about it, ourselves and our athletes that we're working with. If we didn't care at all about sport, if we didn't care about how it went or the time and energy that we invested into it, we probably wouldn't experience as many emotions, and definitely not as strong. So understanding that we have a lot of those emotions, they join us on this bus and in sport, and they're there because we care, we invest our time. So the first step is to know who's on the bus. The next slide that I have is to look at knowing who's on the bus. And I have a wheel there, an emotion wheel. If you Google emotion wheel, you'll get tons of different examples. But here's some of the potential emotions you might feel or things that might be on that bus. You might have fear, anger, disgust, sad, happiness, surprise, relates to excitement, like was said as well. And those are some different emotions that are on there. And the more that we have words to label our emotions for ourselves as well as for our athletes, the more we're going to be able to work with them. It's like our tool for measuring emotions is the emotional vocabulary that we have. I think a lot of times working with athletes, in my experience, athletes and non-athletes, is that people often say, oh, I feel good or bad, or they say, I'm upset. When things are going well, it's upset. But what does upset mean? That gives you a bit of information, I guess, but upset could be anger. Upset could be happiness. Upset could be sadness. Upset, or not happiness, but it could be, disgusted, could be upset. We could have a lot of those different feelings, and a lot of them fall into upset. So it's not the best gauge of, oh, I don't feel good, or I feel upset. So we want to have more words with that. The analogy that I like to use for that is, I imagine a lot of you either have yourself or know somebody who's done some baking during COVID, right? And maybe you're making cookies or muffins or something, and if you were doing that, and you tried to say, if the recipe called for, we'll say a teaspoon of something, we'll say a teaspoon of baking powder, and you try to measure that with the 1 cup, and try to measure a teaspoon, how would that work out, right? Probably wouldn't be a good measure. I mean, you know that a teaspoon's less than the 1 cup, that, okay, great, but you wouldn't really get a precise measure, right? So vocabulary and emotional vocabulary is like our tool for measuring our emotions, for getting greater awareness and a more accurate measure of what's going on for ourselves and for others around us. So I show this tool, and the image that's on there has so many different emotions. You can start in the middle and work your way out. The tool isn't there to really know all those. I wouldn't be able to label all those emotions that are on there with the whole picture. But the goal really is, to use something like that as a tool in order to check in and say, okay, instead of upset, maybe I'm feeling angry. And if you look within anger there, maybe you know, there's something a little bit more specific there. Maybe it's frustration, or maybe, you know, maybe it's just that you feel annoyed. So there's a lot of different emotions there, and we need to know who's on the bus first. What different things can we experience, and what are we experiencing? The next step that I have is step 2. Where do those emotions want to take us? Where do they want to go? Each emotion, they know where they want to go. Emotions are there. They help us. They do serve a purpose. And that purpose is to help us often act quickly, to keep us safe, to keep us motivated. And each emotion knows where they want to go. So we can think of an emotion, and you know, then we'll act on that. It just, we know where we want to go with a certain emotion. That's one of the reasons we have emotions, is so we can act really quickly without maybe overthinking or acting in a certain way. But each emotion brings luggage on the bus. And when I talk about luggage on the bus, it's like each emotion is on that bus, but it also takes a lot of space, and its influence is, what does that bring with us? It doesn't just bring that one feeling with it. It influences us in a lot of different ways. So we need to know where that emotion wants to take us. And we also need to know, how is it going to influence us in our journey on this bus? So one is it influences our body sensations, right? Emotions influence how we feel in our body. And I have some examples there. Nervous, sad, and mad tend to be 3 really common examples of emotions that show up in sport. So nervous, when we're nervous, our body starts to sweat, right? We start to breathe a little bit heavier. We can feel butterflies in our stomach. So that baggage, right, that luggage, okay, nervous just brought all those body sensations along the ride with us. Sadness, when we feel sad, we feel heavy, right? We feel more tired. We may experience headaches, and that's our body response when we're feeling sad. Mad, when we're mad, we'll feel hot. Sometimes we feel hot in the face. We feel muscle tension, right? We might feel tense. I know people who are mad, we can feel tension through our shoulders and neck or in our jaw. Our heart rate can go up. So we can feel a lot of different body sensations, and it's important to be aware of what body sensations are matched up with different emotions. That can help athletes become more aware of their emotions and their body responses, but also coaches, right? Because we're performers as well, as a group of coaches, and you know, as humans, we're all impacted by emotions. For baggage, next, it can impact our actions. So emotions, one of the functions of them is that they impact how we act, help us act quickly, but sometimes that action is just not most effective for sport. So think about, you know, when we're nervous, sometimes when we're nervous, our actions might look at playing it safe. So if it's in basketball, maybe somebody who's nervous might pass the ball off instead of taking that game-winning shot, right? Because they want to play it safe. Avoidance tends to be key. When people are nervous, they tend to avoid the things that make them feel nervous, right? They may look stiff, right, in their actions and their movements. And we know that that can get in the way of sport performance as well. Sadness, right? It may look as low effort. Well, if somebody's feeling, you know, sluggish and heavy and they're sad, that emotion might come across as low effort. It might look like they're, you know, playing with a lower intensity. They may look slow and heavy in their actions. Somebody who's mad, it may look like they're careless, right? When we're mad, we tend to be more impulsive. We make quicker decisions. We can make a careless mistake maybe, or we can come across as more aggressive. So understanding that baggage, those emotions impact our actions as well as our body response. And finally, a really important one to be aware of, and I left this blank because I wanted to ask all the coaches in the group here, is it impacts our verbal and nonverbal communication. Nonverbal being like body language and those things, but also verbal, how we speak. How do you think nervousness, if you took a guess or stab at it, how does that impact our communication if somebody's nervous? If you're nervous, or if you're working with an athlete who's nervous? Mm-hmm. Yeah, they'll talk less. Yeah, the avoidance. Yeah, right. Somebody who's nervous is probably really can't speak properly. Yeah, they might stutter, right? Nervousness, stuttering. There we go. Unable to clearly express how they feel, shut down, deny how they feel. Yeah, and nervousness brings about all those things, right? Somebody who's nervous is probably less likely to speak up in the group. I think that's a big one. in terms of communication. Maybe we'll see less eye contact too, right? Maybe they're not making as much eye contact. Yeah, great job for everybody who participated. I really appreciate that in the chat. What about sadness? How might sadness impact communication? Sadness, so like breaking down. Any other ideas of how sadness might impact? Yeah, you might see crying, you might see tears, right? In a nonverbal, you might see some, yeah, no communication as well. A trembly voice. Yeah. Don't want to do that. Yeah, like absolutely, right? The sadness impacts our communication as well. And yeah, that's great. Fantastic. You guys nailed it. What about anger or when you're mad, yourself or an athlete? How might that show up in communication? Shouting, yeah. Shouting is really a big one for anger. I'm sure we've all been in that position at some point or another, in where we might have yelled or raised our voice when we feel anger. So step 2 is knowing where those emotions want to take us. It's really about knowing, okay, when I feel these emotions, it's going to impact my body, right? Here's how emotion impacts my body response. Here's how it impacts how I'm going to act or how my athletes are going to act. Here's how it's going to influence the communication styles and how I interact with others. And that's really important to be aware of. So these are the ways that my emotions are influencing me before I even begin. So emotions influence us, they influence our athletes, and it's important to understand the various areas. It also impacts us mentally. I mean, emotions can impact our attention, where we pay attention to different things. It can impact, somebody who's sad is probably replaying mistakes over in their head, right? Somebody who's nervous is probably worrying about the future. So it impacts our thoughts as well. So all those things are connected. Step 3, which is really the critical piece. It's knowing that where do our emotions want to take us? Where do they want us to go? And at the same time, it's asking, do we want to go to the same place? Are we being effective? And this is almost the most crucial step in that process, because it's knowing, do me and my emotions, are we on the same page here? And do we want to get to the same spot, right? Can anybody in the chat give me an example of somewhere when you've been at that crossroads, right? And your emotions are saying, let's do this, let's go this way. And at the same time, you're like, no, what I want to do, what my goal is of this situation is this way. And so we can act off emotions, which is impulse, which is quick, right? Which is maybe, yeah, it's really impulsive, but where we want to go is about being effective and more deliberate. Can somebody maybe give me a situation where that may come up for them, or a situation where you felt like you've been at that crossroads?
Hi, Chris. How are you?
Good, good.
So because of my sports is table tennis, so when your player is winning some matches and some points, and you really want to shout and say yes, he did it, but you have to keep quiet at the same level. That creates a lot of confusion sometimes.
Yeah, that's an awesome example. I played table tennis a lot myself, so I know how exciting it can be. And so, in that situation, yeah, your emotions like, let's cheer them on, let's go, they're doing great. Because we're just watching somebody that we care about performing well. I mean, we probably feel proud and excited there. So excitement might be driving us a certain way. Excited in our body response might be our heart rate going up. We might feel a jolt of energy, right? Excited in terms of our actions might make us want to yell or communicate, cheer on more. But we also have another job, right, to be more effective of what's our goal in the moment. Maybe we don't want to be a distraction to our athlete who's performing well, right? So we're at that crossroads, and instead of just turning away emotions and blocking them out, it's knowing, what is my goal of this situation, and where does my emotion want to take me, and how might my emotion influence me in that pursuit of that goal. I think another common scenario Oh, I'm just reading the chat there. Action sport athlete. Part of me wanted to quit, never face fears, and the other part wanted me to push through it and come back stronger. Yeah, I mean, fear. When we feel fear, that fear emotion wants to keep us safe, right? So fear will keep us away from everything that's dangerous, right? So if we experience an accident in sport, fear is going to want to keep us away. It's like, don't go do that. That was scary. That was hurtful. So fear is going to keep us away. But if our goal in that situation is to get back to performing our best, well, then guess what? We're not speaking the same language with our emotions. So we have to understand that fear is on that bus, right? At that point, fear makes me want to stay safe in these things. And that makes sense from a fear perspective. But my goal is this. And sometimes a good saying to keep in your back pocket is saying, sometimes you have to act an opposite. Sometimes we do have to act an opposite of our emotions, and keep that in mind. Next slide is sometimes it's a matter of where we want to go, and it's like that emotion doesn't want to go to the same spot. But sometimes I have the speed limit sign there, and sometimes emotions maybe have a different idea of how fast or how slow. Maybe they want you to break the speed limit or do something a little bit different. Like sometimes we get angry, for instance. We can get angry at a referee. I'm sure none of the coaches on this call, that's never happened to, but I've happened to get mad at a referee a time or two. And when I get angry, I'm angry at the ref because the ref just hurt my chance of winning, right? Made a bad call that I disagreed with and it hurt my chance of winning. And so, I mean, that anger there, my goal is to win. My anger is like on the same side. It's saying like, hey, let's win here. You want to win. But that anger is like, take that all out on the ref in terms of winning. So it's telling me to go 100 miles an hour at whatever's right in my way. It's the intensity of that anger that's too much, right? A little bit of anger, I can use that. Okay, there's a bad call. I feel a little angry. I'll use a little bit of that anger, and maybe it'll motivate me and put that towards effort, right? To push a little bit harder. So sometimes it's not a matter of what emotion we're feeling. Sometimes it's the intensity of it as well. So to keep that in mind. So that's really a three-step approach I go through, and I think it's important for coaches as performers, but as well as what I go through with the athletes that I work with in terms of regulating emotions. So again, those three steps are: know who's on the bus, know what emotion you're feeling, get some vocabulary that you can really check in with, know what influence those emotions have on you and where they want to take you, and know what your goal of the situation is, because sometimes emotions act in a way that's counterintuitive to your goals. So the second piece of this presentation, I want to shift gears a little bit in terms of working with the emotions that your athletes are experiencing. And step one is really going through the three steps that we just went over. It's having self-awareness. How am I feeling? How might that impact me? And what is my goal of this interaction? When you approach an athlete who's experiencing emotions, it's really important to do your own self-awareness first in your own check-in, because that'll help guide you through that situation with the athlete. Now, I have a question on here, and this can be one, I know we said to use the chat, but it might be easier if one person or two people want to jump in on the mic, just because it can be a tricky question. But do you think there's a difference between agreement and understanding? Like agreeing and disagreeing with somebody and understanding them. Is there a difference between those two things? We got absolutely, I got yes. Yes. Agreement can be passive. Okay. Could anybody want to jump in on the mic and just share a question or two or a comment or two of how those things are different? Yeah, you can agree without understanding. Yeah, sometimes we don't need to understand why. Yeah, I agree with my wife all the time, but I don't necessarily understand. Yeah, I hear you on that. That's pretty funny. I can relate.
Yeah, Chris, I was
Yep.
thinking, I think in agreement, it can be vocalized sometimes. Understanding is more like, with psychology, right? So it's like, it's more into your mind is going, you're understanding everything. You don't need to say yes and no. You can just nod your head too sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting, from what I see in the chat and the comment there, thanks for sharing, is we said that we can agree without understanding, and that's absolutely true. In terms of working with the emotions of our athletes, sometimes we're in the position with athletes or other coaches or anybody that we have to work with, is sometimes we have to be able to understand without agreeing. And that's where working with other people's emotions, that's one of the most fundamental skills, is to be able to say, hey, I disagree with this person, but I need to understand where they're coming from. And when you take that perspective that everybody comes to their own opinion and their own perspective for a reason, right? And I may not agree with them, but your job in working with emotions of others is to understand where that person's coming from. And so it's the ability we can agree without understanding, but the important skill for this emotion piece is to be able to understand someone when we disagree. But it can be hard to do. If somebody said, for example, Canada is the worst country, it's just the absolute worst country. If I say that, I'm Canadian, I don't believe that myself, but I try to think of something that everybody would, or most people might disagree with a little bit. If I say Canada's the worst country, right? And if I say that, right, it might be hard for you to say, like, you might say, no, Chris, like, come on. It's a great country. It's actually one of the better countries. It's great because of this reason. How can you think that? And sometimes when we don't agree with somebody, we try to argue our own point, right? We try to use reason and logic and explain our own perspective. What I challenge you to do when somebody's feeling an emotion and they come to you, even if you agree or disagree, is to set agreement and disagreement aside and to say, my first job is to understand that person. So if I say Canada's the worst country in the world, okay, why does he think that? Like, yeah, okay, why do you think that? And everybody's emotions are always valid, and how they feel is always valid. You may not feel the same way, but they come to their own views for their own reasons. So the next slide I have is like the picture there, and perspective can be really important, right? One person says, oh, that's a 6. And the next person looks and says, oh, that's a 9. Well, I mean, if we just think in terms of logic and reason, they could argue that all day long. Because they know that's a 6. How could you not see that as a 6? Right? Because we disagree. Those two people would disagree. They go back and forth the whole time. But I think a more important question when we're working with emotions or working with understanding somebody is to say, why did they come to that conclusion? I'm looking at this, I see you at 6. Put yourself in that person's shoes a little bit. And there's a lot of reasons why people can come to different conclusions, right? Genetically, we're all different, right? So genetics can play a role in how we experience emotion in different situations. We all have a different history. We all have different learning. People have different experiences with the same thing. So my example with Canada, I'm sure I've had a great experience with Canada, but I'm sure other people might have had a different experience. So I can't say right and wrong, but that person came to their conclusion and maybe had a different experience with that, right? And so there's a lot of other factors at play, but to take the perspective when we're working with athletes and their emotions to say, it's not about agreeing and disagreeing, it's let's understand them first. Let's say they feel that way for a reason. Why do they feel that way? Because I think we can be really quick to jump towards jumping to agree and disagree and using basically reason. So this next slide is one that I feel is really important to think about and take home. If you took home 2 points, I think maybe one would be the understanding there's a difference between agreeing and disagreeing and understanding somebody, and the second would be this, is speaking the same language. So we have the brain and the heart there, right? And they're fighting it out. And sometimes the brain thinks like logic and reason, and it thinks in terms of, facts, right? It's like 1 + 1 = 2. The brain's really great at that, right? And the heart, which is where we feel our emotions aren't always logical. They don't always make sense, right? I'm sure we've interacted with somebody and it's like, I don't understand. Like, that doesn't make sense logically. But emotions aren't always logical. That doesn't make them invalid, but sometimes we can be speaking a different language. So if an athlete approaches us and are feeling very emotional, before we can get to the logic, we have to speak the emotional language to them. We have to get on the same page. And so in this slide, I have a couple ways of getting there. Because if we just say, speak about the facts, that's not going to validate that person's experience. So imagine an athlete, I think probably a lot of us work with student athletes. And if a student athlete came, oh, I'm kind of bummed because I failed this test. And you go to them, and you say, oh, well, that's okay. You'll get the next one. Well, yeah, logically that makes sense, but I don't think you've spoken their language. You haven't acknowledged that what they just said, right? Or if they failed that test and say, well, you didn't do that poorly. You didn't do that poorly. You'll still pass the course. I think you're overthinking. It's not that big of a deal. It'll be okay. And those are all like logical things. They make sense, but it's not really speaking that emotional language. So we want to be able to speak, and understand empathy. So we want to understand that person and share that same feeling. If you just fail the test, right, I think it's easy for us to jump to problem solving mode with the brain, with the logic piece. And we can go to problem solving really quickly, but instead it's okay to say a situation sucks. If I come up to you and I say, I just failed the test, be like, oh, that must suck. Like, oh, you're probably really disappointed. There we go. We're speaking the same language there, right? So we're speaking the same language, right? An athlete's really disappointed after, maybe the last little bit of their play has been really, oh, I'm playing so awful. Like, yeah, well, I get that you're, pretty disappointed in your play. I get you're having a rough go right now. Instead of saying, oh, well, it's not that bad. You're doing okay. Like, sometimes we got to speak the language of emotion, and it's okay to say that something sucks. We have to catch ourselves problem solving. When somebody's really emotional, we have to validate that experience before we can get to the logic and reason piece. And we'll get there to the logic and reason, but first we got to speak to the emotion. So we want to catch problem solving, like at least as a statement to look out for. And you can catch that a lot. Like, oh, you failed the test? Well, at least you're still passing the course, right? Oh, you're playing poorly? Well, at least you still made the team. At least we're still winning games. At least the team's doing well. Yeah, but that person still said something, right? So catch at least statements. Another piece that's really important for speaking the same language with emotions, change but to because. And this one is like a simple, concrete rule that you can do and apply, and it changes a lot of how conversations will go. Because if, this example comes up a lot with apologies. If I was late for this call and I go, oh, I'm sorry, I was late for this call, but you know what? The coaches were late too. But, well, then that's not really an apology if I had but to it, right? Or I'm sorry I'm late, but this and this and this. Like, that's almost congregating excuse. If you change that but to a because, then we're validating that experience. So instead of saying that, I'm sorry I'm late because you guys were here and you guys were ready and I wasted a little bit of your time. I just changed that but to a because, and I explained the situation, and now things go through. So the same thing is, oh, you failed that test, but that's not really that bad, right? Well, if you say, oh, you failed that test, you're probably feeling really disappointed because blah, 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 right? So that's really important, that change that but to because. And two skills as coaches that you can look for when you're working with an athlete who's experiencing emotion at any given time. One is reflect the emotion that they say. So pay attention when you're talking to an athlete. If an athlete says, oh my goodness, I'm so frustrated right now, like my shots just aren't going in, or oh, I'm so frustrated now, like my times, look, they're not really good, I'm not performing well. Well, the key word they said in that sentence was frustration. Oh yeah, I get your frustration. You can reflect that back when athletes use emotion words, and that can be a really useful skill in school in terms of communication. And the other thing that you can do is to label the emotion. And this is where, if you build up your own emotional vocabulary, this is where that athlete will be like, oh my goodness, this coach gets me. And what happens is, imagine if I said to you, I say, look, like I've been working really hard. Like I had a really hard workout, but which was good. And then, so I was tired from that. Then I had some family stuff going on. I didn't sleep well at all. I have so much on my plate right now. If I say that to you, what might I be feeling? What emotions might fit there? Take a guess at labeling my emotion. Overwhelmed, yeah. That's how I feel. That's one way, yeah. What else might I feel? There's one other one that came to mind for me when I was giving that explanation. Stressed, yeah. Stressed, overwhelmed. Tired, yeah. I'm probably exhausted, right? I'm exhausted, I'm overwhelmed. So if you say to that athlete in that case, oh my goodness, you must be exhausted, you just validated how they felt and you created that label for them, and they'll really feel like you get them because you just labeled that emotion for them. And so that can be a useful skill when working with the emotions of our athletes. Sometimes we're really quick. It's natural for humans basically to want to solve the problem, right? So sometimes people come with a problem or something's bothering them or this, and we want to solve it. Oh, it's not so bad. We downplay it. We try to solve the problem with reason. What that person really wants is they want you to feel that and feel understood, and they get it. And part of that is saying like, things suck sometimes. This is how you might feel. And if you take a guess, like if you were to take a guess at me in my scenario and got it wrong, I would have been like, no, that's not quite it. And then we'll just have a discussion. Like it happens all the time, and it's okay. You'll miss sometimes when you guess, but it can really help you feel like you get them. So the last slide that I have is that every trip you take on that bus has traffic, and a quick check-in for yourself or for the athletes that tends to be really easy and quick to use is I say, think of a traffic light. And what does green mean? Green means go. Things are good. Emotionally, we're on the same page in terms of our goals, our emotions. Things are going well. We're feeling great. We're performing great. Things are good. Red light is when we got to stop. It's like, oh, I got to stop what I'm doing right now. I got to change something because my emotions are really strong right now, and I got to stop because things aren't kind of going the most effective right now. And I think that's important. And I think as athletes, they tend to be really aware of when things are green or red. But some of the most important pieces is to know what's yellow light. When do things start to head in that direction emotionally where you got to slow down? When you get to the yellow light and you need to slow down, because it's a lot easier to go from yellow to green than from red to green, right? And when we know what are the triggers, what are the things that tend to trigger us to get the yellow light? What does yellow light look like for us? Do the same with red and green, but when we get an understanding of what yellow light is, and for our athletes as well, then it helps us stay in the green a lot more effective. And so that can be a mental check-in for them in terms of motion. Hey, are you red, green, yellow right now? Where's that at, right? And along the same lines, I did want to add too, is that emotions, sometimes we use the words good and bad. And I feel like sometimes with emotions, like that's not true. All emotions serve a purpose. It's just not always the purpose in that moment. So don't say like there's a right and wrong emotion. I feel like sometimes we say like, don't feel that way, or you shouldn't feel that way, or every emotion is valid. It's just not always fitting our goals of a situation. So I say label emotions as effective or ineffective. Is that effective right now, or is it ineffective? The other thing is, instead of labeling good and bad, emotions can be pleasant or unpleasant rather than good or bad. Like it doesn't feel pleasant to be nervous, to be angry, to be sad, right? Rather than bad. So quick check-in with that traffic light. So that's what I had for you all this evening. I'm happy to take any questions that you have. I appreciate the sharing that went on in the chat and even over the mic. And I hope that you took something away in terms of working with emotion.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. And yeah, like he said, if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourselves or type it in the chat box. But yeah, Chris, that was awesome and definitely makes up for my rocky start. So thank you. Hopefully you guys aren't hearing any lawnmowers now.
No, you did it. You nailed it with the slides too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, that was perfect. I was impressed because I started and I was like, she's not going to know when to change the slides here. But you did an awesome job.
I was getting the flow, yeah.
Chris,
I see some positive comments in the chat. I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
A question for you, Chris.
Yes.
How will you deal with someone who is very emotional in sports?
Yeah, very emotional. I mean, I think it's going through that 3-step process. I think sometimes when people are very emotional, one is they don't always have the best vocabulary for labeling their emotions. So every emotion feels really big. And sometimes people who tend to be emotional don't always know what's going on, right? So everything feels big and we don't understand it. And that can cause emotions to get really big. So I challenge you to kind of even give that emotion wheel or Google an emotion wheel, start labeling emotions. Can be like that first step, like the first 3 steps. Understand, hey, how does that emotion impact you? Right? Okay, what's your goal of that situation? But I think labeling emotions is the first step. I think also when you're working with somebody who might be very emotional, it's really important to do those later steps of validating that emotion, because somebody who's very emotional, I mean, they're more tiring probably. We probably feel more frustrated working with somebody. Oh, they're emotional again. That impacts us, and so that person's experience and how we feel with that person, right? That might come across to every other person that person interacts with. So they may be emotional, and how we interact with them might also be fueling their emotion. So being aware of, am I adding to that in any way? Because yeah, you know what, they are maybe emotional and maybe I have less patience for them, but then your emotion is fueling theirs. So being aware of that, understanding labeling the emotion, I think is another key point. And also even having a conversation of with that person, hey, what are the triggers that trigger your emotion, right? Like red, green, yellow light. What triggers? Is it a ref making a bad call? What are the things that trigger your emotions? And when you can think about it as coaches or even with your athletes, and when we think about what triggers our emotions outside of the heat of the moment, that can be really powerful for us, because we can think about our emotions right now pretty clearly. We can think about our anger, how it influences us, great. But if I went up to you, right, when imagine you're super pissed, you just lost a really important game. And I go up to you and I say, hey, look, your anger, like, it's making you yell right now. You'd be like, Chris, like, shut up. Leave me alone. That would just be fueling your anger. So thinking about how those things influence us away from the heat of the moment. The heat of the moment's not a time to tell somebody, like, calm down, do this, do that. It's like, hey, I get you're frustrated right now. So I guess like 8 different answers to that question. But yeah.
Great, thank you, Chris. And I've received a couple private questions. So first one is, how do you approach a defensive athlete?
Yeah, a defensive athlete. So I imagine that's almost a case where maybe you're giving some feedback, or somebody is maybe going on that agreement, disagreement kind of part, right? And you go back and forth with defensive. I ask the question, when somebody's defensive and not receiving what you're doing, we try to convince them more of like, no, here's why you got to listen. Here's why this, here's this. I would almost take the approach, okay, they're defensive. I'd say why? Even ask them, like, okay, you don't want to do this or this, why not? Right? Like, I think they can have information. It's okay to call it out. Be like, hey, I'm seeing this. Like, where's that come from? I'm asking you to do this, and this is a pattern I'm seeing. I want to know why. And when we put effort into understanding their position first, then going to the logic reason, we'll get farther. And I think it's really quick to jump ahead. So I think a defensive athlete, I think it's taking that approach. They're probably defensive for their own reasons. Let's understand why. And that might be something to do with us and this current sport environment. It could be their past experience too. Sometimes we evaluate an athlete based on what's going on right in that moment, but maybe it has nothing to do with you. Maybe before they had a coach who maybe pushed them way too hard all the time, so they had to be defensive, because if they weren't, then maybe they'd get pushed like beyond their limit. It had nothing to do with you, but their past experience taught them that defensiveness worked, right? So there's so many reasons, and trying to understand why, I guess, would be my answer to that.
Great, yeah, I love that. Sorry, yeah, I'll just read out the next question. So how to handle emotions in important situations in big games or late in games, etc.
Yeah, that's also big, right? It's the big games. I think 2 things. One is anticipate them, right? We can anticipate that people will feel nervous and people will be that. So like, think about it beforehand. Think about how the pressure situation and face that, right? A little bit. I think when we feel pressure or nerves, I mean, the function of nerves is to avoid, and we know that. So we might block out the pressure. We might not think about it. I'll challenge you to actually get your athletes to think about, the situations and think through it. Okay, what's it like to have that big crowd there? What's it like when the game's on the line? Like, and visualization can be a really good skill for that. I think another thing is giving yourself a little bit of room to experience emotion. If you think you shouldn't be nervous at all, like sometimes you're like, oh no, I'm nervous. And then we get nervous about being nervous. And it's like, oh, I shouldn't be nervous. It's a big game and I'm nervous. Now I'm nervous because I'm nervous. If you say, hey, it makes sense for you to be a little bit nervous here, great. It's not going to escalate on that second level. So understanding it makes sense to be a little bit nervous here, right? Giving a little bit of space, thinking about it in advance and facing it. And the other thing is like breathing techniques is really big for a lot of that too, because we know emotions impact our body response, right? As we went through briefly. Well, having a proper breathing and practicing that in advance as a skill leading up to the big moment, right, will help you then too. So mindfulness practice is also really big, and breathing techniques would be two that I would say are skills that you practice before the big events that'll help you in the big event.
Yeah, great. And on the mindfulness topic too, we had Bryce come on last week to discuss mindfulness. So definitely check out that recording on YouTube if you're looking for some tips on breathing or looking for some apps too that you can share with your athletes. He goes through a lot of great advice there. Next question is, how do you help an athlete focus on the task at hand when their emotions are being distracted?
Yeah, I mean, emotions can be a big distraction. I think often we think of external distractions. We think of the crowd or the other players on another team or our environment, but we have internal distractions too. Emotions, our thoughts, all those things can be distractions that can get in our way. And how do I help athletes? I mean, when they're being distracted by their emotion, I think the self-awareness piece is a big part of that. It's being aware of, hey, I get distracted by emotions, so check in, hey, notice that, and then knowing what to focus on. So if an athlete's getting distracted, saying, hey, like instead of telling too, sometimes asking can be helpful. Hey, what do you want to be focused on right now? And giving a concrete answer of like, what are the parts of this task to focus on? I think just like knowing what to redirect to. Sometimes when we say what not to do, it's not the most helpful. If I say like, don't think of a purple elephant, right? You're going to think of that purple elephant. So I say, don't get distracted by those emotions. Don't think about your emotions. Well, there we go. We're going to start thinking about it even more. So giving a replacement cue or direction, I think is really important when we're getting distracted by emotions. Another skill I teach the athletes that I work with is to observe emotions. So what I mean by that is observe your thoughts, observe your emotions. And sometimes it's like, instead of saying, oh, I'm worried about messing up, and that could be an internal distraction that's going on, being like, oh, I noticed that thought cross my mind. I noticed that there, and now I'm going to redirect. So it's almost being an observer of your experience, and redirecting is one of the skills that I teach for that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. And again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to speak up now or type in the chat box.
Yeah, great question so far, everyone.
Okay, well, if you have anything, just type in the chat box, but for now, I'll start closing. So thank you again, Chris, for an awesome presentation, and thank you so much to everyone from joining us across the country. It's so great to see we have some people from Ontario and BC on, and maybe some other provinces, and definitely from within the Atlantic provinces. So we love to see that, and thank you for asking questions and being engaged at this time. Our next presentation is tomorrow night with Tina. So she's been on here a couple of times. She's a mental performance consultant with Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic. And this time she's going to be doing kind of a different presentation. It might be more of like a workshop and really open dialogue. We're going to kind of figure out and discuss how we can apply all of these things we've been learning over the past 3 months, because I'm sure many of you have been attending webinars even apart from the Coach Socialization series. So sorry, there's a dog fight going on behind me. But so yeah, it'll be a great workshop tomorrow at 8 p.m. and it might go a little bit longer than an hour, but we definitely encourage you to come on and stay as long as you can. And then we're going to be taking a break next week just because we know it's Canada Day and there might be some people taking a bit of vacation, and then we'll pick things up the week after that. So hopefully we can see you guys tomorrow night and then in 2 weeks from that time. So thank you so much everyone for attending, and thanks again, Chris, this was great. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I appreciate it.